In the quiet town of Amityville, New York, the autumn of 1974 brought a tragedy that would forever alter its history. At the center was Ronald DeFeo Jr., a young man whose name would become tied to one of the most infamous cases of the decade. What began as whispers of a troubled family soon erupted into headlines that gripped the nation. Behind the walls of a seemingly ordinary suburban home, events unfolded that left both investigators and neighbors shaken, struggling to make sense of the darkness that had emerged from within. The silence that settled over 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, Long Island on the morning of November 14, 1974, was the kind that follows unspeakable violence. Inside the Dutch colonial house, 6 members of the DeFeo family lay dead in their beds, each killed by a single gunshot from a .35 caliber Marlin rifle. The killer was someone they knew intimately, someone they had trusted enough to let into their most vulnerable space. Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr., known as Butchie to his family, had always been trouble. At 23, he was a hulking young man with dark hair and darker impulses, a drug addict who'd been stealing from his father's car dealership to fund his habit. But nothing in his troubled history suggested he was capable of what happened that November night. To their neighbors in the affluent Long Island community, the DeFeos appeared to have it all. Ronald DeFeo Sr. owned a successful Buick dealership in Brooklyn, providing his family with a comfortable lifestyle in their $80,000 home. Louise DeFeo was a devoted mother who kept their 4 children, Ronald Jr., Dawn, Allison, and the 2 youngest boys, Mark and John Matthew, in line while her husband worked long hours building his business. But behind the manicured lawn and picture windows, the DeFeo household was a powder keg. Ronald Sr. had a violent temper and frequently beat his eldest son. The family dynamic was toxic, a volatile mix of physical abuse, emotional manipulation, and Ronald Jr.'s escalating drug problems and erratic behavior. What exactly happened during the early morning hours of November 13, 1974, remains partially shrouded in mystery, complicated by Ronald Jr.'s shifting accounts and obvious lies. What investigators know for certain is this. Sometime around 3 a.m., someone moved methodically through the DeFeo house, executing each family member while they slept. The victims were found face down in their beds, Ronald Sr. 43 and Louise 42, in the master bedroom, Dawn 18, in her room Allison 13, and Mark 12 in their rooms, and little John Matthew, just 9 years old, in his bedroom. Each had been shot once at close range. Strangely, none of the neighbors reported hearing gunshots, despite the rifle's substantial noise. Even more puzzling was the lack of struggle. The family appeared to have remained asleep as death moved from room to room. No defensive wounds, no signs they had attempted to flee or fight back. It was as if they had been drugged or silenced by some other means. Ronald Jr.'s behavior in the immediate aftermath was a masterclass in misdirection. On the evening of November 13th, he showed up at Henry's bar in Amityville, frantic and incoherent, claiming he'd returned home to find his family murdered. "You got to help me," he shouted to the stunned patrons. "I think my mother and father are shot." His performance was convincing enough that several bar patrons accompanied him back to Ocean Avenue, where they discovered the horrific scene. Police arrived to find Ronald Jr. playing the role of devastated son and brother, sobbing and demanding they find the killers who had destroyed his family. But his story began falling apart almost immediately. Ronald Jr. claimed he'd been at work all day and had spent the evening with friends, but his timeline was inconsistent. He seemed to know details about the crime scene that he shouldn't have known. And then there were the inconsistencies in his emotional responses, moments where his grief seemed performative rather than genuine. Under interrogation, Ronald Jr.'s elaborate story crumbled. After hours of questioning, he finally confessed to the murders, though his explanation defied comprehension. He claimed voices had commanded him to kill his family. He said Dawn had helped him commit the murders before he killed her too, a claim that contradicted all physical evidence. The truth, as investigators pieced it together, was both simpler and more disturbing. Ronald Jr. had likely drugged his family's dinner, explaining their failure to wake during the shooting. He had then systematically executed each family member, possibly motivated by a combination of rage toward his abusive father, resentment over being cut off financially, and his deteriorating mental state exacerbated by heavy drug use. During his 1975 trial, Ronald Jr.'s defense team attempted an insanity plea, arguing that he had been driven to murder by voices and visions. His lawyer, William Weber, built a case claiming DeFeo was an insane man who became a killer because of demonic voices in his head. DeFeo claimed that voices from the house had commanded him to kill, and Weber argued his client heard demons who commanded him to murder his loved ones as they slept. But there was a crucial problem with this supernatural defense. No neighbor reported anything unusual during the time that the DeFeos lived there before the murders. The family had never complained of paranormal activity, strange voices, or supernatural disturbances to friends, neighbors, or clergy. There were no reports of the DeFeos seeking help from priests or paranormal investigators. Most people who knew the DeFeos considered them to be a nice, normal family, outwardly kind and religious. Years later, the truth about DeFeo's supernatural claims would emerge. In a 1992 interview with the New York Times, DeFeo admitted he made up hearing voices on the advice of his lawyer, William Weber, to make the story more attractive for future book and movie contracts. "William Weber gave me no choice," DeFeo said. "He told me I had to do this. He told me there would be a lot of money from book rights and a movie." The prosecution painted a different picture: a cold-blooded killer who had planned and executed the murders of his entire family for money and revenge. The prosecution's psychiatrist, Dr. Harold Zolan, maintained that although DeFeo was a user of heroin and LSD, he had antisocial personality disorder and was aware of his actions at the time of the crime. Multiple people who knew Ronald at the time told the New York Times the problem wasn't evil spirits, but rather the defendant's issues with drugs and alcohol. The DeFeo murders should have been the end of the story, but Ocean Avenue had one more chapter to write. 13 months after the murders, the Lutz family moved into the house, having purchased it at a significant discount due to its grim history. They lasted just 28 days before fleeing, claiming the house was haunted by malevolent spirits. Their story became the Amityville Horror, spawning books, movies, and decades of debate about whether the supernatural claims were real or an elaborate hoax. Ronald Jr., serving his life sentence, watched from prison as his family's tragedy was transformed into a profitable horror franchise. Ronald DeFeo Jr. spent the rest of his life in prison, dying in March 2021 at age 69. Over the decades, he gave numerous interviews, often changing his story about what happened that night. Sometimes he claimed innocence. Other times he implicated his sister, Dawn, as an accomplice. He even suggested the mob had killed his family, but he never provided a coherent, believable explanation for the murders that destroyed 6 lives and forever marked a house on Ocean Avenue. What drove a young man to systematically execute his entire family remains, in many ways, unknowable. Was it the cycle of abuse that had shaped his childhood, his addiction and deteriorating mental health, a psychopathic break that allowed him to see his family members not as human beings, but as obstacles to be removed? Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the DeFeo murders isn't the supernatural folklore that followed, but the very human capacity for evil that preceded it. In the end, no haunted house story could be more terrifying than the simple truth. Sometimes the monster isn't a ghost or demon, it's someone who shares your last name, sits at your dinner table, and kisses you goodnight. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue still stands, its address long since changed in a futile attempt to escape its history. But the story of what happened there, on November 13, 1974, serves as a permanent reminder that the most horrifying evil often wears a familiar face. The Amityville case remains one of the most haunting chapters in true crime history, not just because of what happened within that house, but because of how it continues to echo decades later.
In the end, every shadow leaves its echo, and every tale lingers long after the last words fade. Thank you for walking this dark path with me. Until next time, be kind.